I wanted to address timbre real quick, and you understand timbre of an instrument basically works out to what the sound is. I'm going to try to make this real simple so it's not a half-hour video, but basically you're dealing with timbre. You're basically dealing with the fundamental frequency, the fundamental note. You're dealing with the harmonic content that's in it, and go back and watch the other video to understand a little better about harmonic content and what that means. A non-harmonic content, the vibrato of frequency content, and modulations of frequency content, and also fluctuations and changes and all of those things that I just spoke of. And it's that simple. There may be some other characteristics of a timbre, distortions. I mean, an example of that is if you're playing the flute and your lip moves a little different or something like that, or you blow off to the side and it starts to change the harmonic content or the distortion quality to it, and that can be a huge effect and can have a huge impact on the timbre as well. But basic understanding of it is basically that. And the other part that you need to understand about a timbre is basically the quasi-periodic nature of it. That this is like, let's say you've got a periodic waveform that you created on the synth or some patch that you have. And it looks the same all the way across. And it's periodic. Well, most timbres are not periodic. They're quasi-periodic. Meaning all those things I talked about at the first part, that they'll be changing and fluctuating, all over the place. And it depends on, if you're playing louder or softer or at a different position on the instrument. There can be all kinds of parts of that can change the actual timbre of the sound. One thing I want to address is phase. When you're looking at a complex waveform, and you're looking at a complex waveform, and it's like, well, a complex waveform, any type of a complex waveform, and let's say that this timbre of this instrument looks like this, and it looks like that on there. Well, you've got one oboe here and one oboe there that you're looking at on an oscilloscope. All those things that we talked about can change how the timbre looks on the oscilloscope. So you'll be looking at it, and eventually you get looking at the oscilloscope, and you're like, I don't even turn it on ever because it doesn't mean nothing to me. Because all those fluctuations cause a quasi-periodic nature to the waveform, so it doesn't look static and the same all the way across. And phase. When you've got a complex waveform that's like, let's say that you've got, let me see if I can find it here. You've got if you've got a picture of a waveform that looks like this, and it's like, well, it might look like this. Now, these are, the phase of them is in unison. And there's another video that give you just a real quick definition of phase. Well, if any of these change in phase, the degree that they start on that this waveform can look different. So you can also be looking at a complex waveform of the same timbre of the same instrument, and the phase is different, and it makes the waveform look different. So it can be a little confusing when you're looking at that, but most of the time the basic outline of it isn't that difficult to understand, because you have the harmonic content, non-harmonic content, actually that composes that instrument's timbre. And this flute here, or this violin, those are basically the harmonics that are in it, at what decibel they are as a static view. Does that make sense? But the actual timbre, a lot of these will be fluctuating up and down, modulating, and they'll have vibrato in them and all kinds of things that, and fluctuations of them that cause the timbre of the instrument. Does that make sense? And I hope I've made that very simple to understand, so that when you're looking at harmonics or harmonic series, and you're saying, well, this is a square wave, and it's like, well, it's static. You can see it all the way across. There's no actual timbre to that, or the qualities of a timbre. I mean, it's just static frequencies that are combined to make that waveform, and there's no fluctuations and added, things that vibrato and modulations and fluctuations of the actual frequencies, and or added distortion, like we talked about with how you hold your mouth on the flute or something, might add some harmonic distortion added to the content as the performance goes along, which can change the waveform, and from one player to another, that the actual timbre may look different or sound different because of the way they're playing, which can have a huge impact. Like you're listening to one sax player that he sounds like that, and the other one is actually using the instrument different, and it's causing different timbres, different reeds, different ways, different techniques he's using on it. And just like guitar tones, that the timbre will sound different because of all kinds of aspects in the way that they're performing, or the techniques in using that will cause the actual timbre of the instrument to sound different. But the actual basic understanding isn't that difficult. The first thing I said at the beginning of this video is a basic understanding of that, and I'm just kind of outlining some things that can affect the timbre. But it's very simple, and the added harmonic frequencies, or the combined frequencies, just like any other waveform, combine to make a complex or polar waveform, a summed waveform of those sinusoids. And it's that simple. Some of that may sound kind of complex, but it really isn't. And I don't want to make this a real long video. It can get very, 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 very complex. But I'm just trying to give a simple description so you don't ever get confused about what that is. And one other thing I wanted to address is the quasi-periodic nature, to where when you're dealing with synth patches or trying to sculpt sound, that those quasi-periodic nature of all those components and the fluctuations and changes of them is what caused a lot of issues, and people going, well, that choir patch sucks, or that string section sucks, and the more, because of those qualities that are not being addressed as well as in some other, but people might really be addressing them while the other one isn't. And it can really make or break that sound or that patch or that sample that you have. And so that's another thing to remember. And another thing I want to address is when you're processing that, is because of the quasi-periodic nature and how it changes, and how with all the fluctuations, how the frequencies that are in that complex waveform and in that timbre, with all the fluctuations and differences going on between when they're playing loud or soft or blowing harder or off to the side, or whatever, even a singer is a perfect example of that. When he's screeching, or he's quiet, or he's lullabying, or he's kind of somewhere in the middle, then his voice is changing and the whole timbre of his sound is changing, and it might change from one section of a song to another, to where you have to address the processing of that timbre differently. Does that make sense? I hope I made that very clear, because that's a huge thing sometimes when you're doing signal processing or mixing or recording, and doing simple processing on vocals or any other instrument, that's a huge thing. I mean, the guy's singing softer or louder, he's really belting out, or he's somewhere in the middle, and his whole timbre quality of that instrument, his vocals, have changed and need to be approached differently. You can't leave the same thing that you stuck on there through the whole thing, because it changed. The timbre content changed, and it's going to affect it differently, and you have to deal with it almost like it's another instrument, because it has a different timbre. And that, I'm trying to make that real clear so that sinks in, because that can be a huge thing that can really help you while you're working with music. Anyway, I hope I've made that real clear, that you understand that. And basically, the last thing that I wanted to address, if you watch the other video on harmonics and things like that, is that the timbre can actually be, it can be mostly odd harmonics, mostly even harmonics, a combination of even and odd harmonics, and it can also have non-harmonic distortions, and actually it can have harmonic distortions, like I told you in the other video, where the basic harmonic content of it has some non-harmonic distortion in it, but they're actually harmonics, but distortion of that, depending on how the instrument's used, different voicings, techniques, all kinds of things that can affect that. And just to remember that and understand that is a huge thing when you're working with any type of a timbre. So anyway, I hope that that gave you a basic understanding of timbre, and that, you know, at least it opened up the door that you have somewhere to go to, where if you have more questions, you can ask me, or you can Google it and you can look around and see if you can get some other answers. But basically, that's about it. And don't get confused. You get a whole lot of answers about what timbre is and get all confused about what it is, because it's not confusing. It's that simple. And that's what it is. So don't get confused by timbre when you hear about timbre. Remember the first thing I said in the video and what I've explained here, and watch it again if you need to. And you should have a pretty good understanding what timbre is. Some of the things that I talked about, like vibrato and modulations of frequency content, that can get kind of complex. But just understand vibrato of a frequency and or modulations of the frequency, it's a very simple concept, and that can be happening in the frequencies as the frequencies are fluctuating, as the timbre changes and moves and flows as it goes along. And that can be very complex, but just to understand what's happening there, and that those things can be happening there, and sometimes not much, and sometimes a lot, and sometimes some of those fluctuations aren't happening at all, but to understand that those are the components of it and what can be happening, so you have an understanding of what you're seeing on an oscilloscope, what you're seeing on the spectrogram, and what you're seeing in the complex polar waveform when you're looking at it. And the concept is pretty easy, and the understanding is pretty basic. And like I said, you can dig into it a lot if you want and get real technical about it, but that's a basic outline of it, and it's that simple. It's not any really more complicated than that, other than distortion content. You know, distortion content can really vary and cause issues with timbres depending on what the distortion content is in there, and you band passing and understanding how to get noise out of that timbre that's been recorded, or your patch that they didn't, you know, get the noise out of it, and band pass or low pass or high pass, that's got to get the crap out of it, the distortion or lower end distortion, or, you know, things like that. Does that make sense? And understand what you're trying to shape, and understand when you're working with an EQ and you're trying to sculpt this timbre of this vocalist or something, that all those things are fluctuating. So your EQ isn't quasi-periodic most of the time, all over the place, all, you know, like the timbre of the instrument you're dealing with. So understand that, you know, what that means is that you're trying to get a basic containment with your EQ, or address basic issues. But, you know, I mean, you can set up automation for your EQ, and I mean, you can try to automate your, you know, a vocal patch. Try to automate one vocal, you know, with that, like that, with your EQ throughout the whole thing, and try to adjust for every timbre and fluctuation and modulation through the whole thing. I give you about a week or two before you finally pull all your hair out of your head and figure that's not working. But anyway, I hope that gives you a pretty good understanding of timbre, and so that when you're dealing with it in music, that you have a little bit better understanding of what you're dealing with. Peace, self-love, have a nice day.